Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we are going to try to go deep on angel stories.
Huh.
Those narratives that are all about encounters with beings that are, I guess pretty much universally understood as angels.
Right.
And the interesting thing I think here is that these stories, they're not really confined to just, one culture or one period of history. You find them all over the world and throughout time. And I think for our listeners in particular, with your deep Catholic faith and how important both the story and its interpretation are, well, this deep dive is going to be particularly insightful for you.
It really is.
We're going to explore all these different angel stories, looking at, how they show up in history and how they still echo in our world today. And all along the way, we're going to be considering what these narratives might tell us about our connection to something bigger than ourselves, to the divine. So our journey today is going to take us from trying to define exactly what we mean by angels through all the historical accounts. Then we'll look at modern day claims, and finally we'll consider just how significant these celestial beings have been and continue to be in cultures all over the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack all of this.
Well, right off the bat, what really jumps out at me from these sources is how many of these angel stories, they share a similar core. There's this moment of vulnerability or need, and then boom, an intervention that's attributed to an angel, and then the situation resolves. I mean, think about it, but what's even more interesting than that, I think, is that the people who tell these stories, they often talk about profound changes in their perspective, or even in how their lives unfolded. It really makes you wonder, why do we as humans seem so drawn to framing these moments of intense help, or when we feel like we've been saved? Why do we frame those within this narrative of divine intervention? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it really does make you wonder.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating how across so many different cultures, when we talk about angels, there's this shared understanding of them as these spiritual beings who are acting like a crucial link between the divine and us humans. They're messengers, they're protectors, and sometimes they're even seen as, carrying out God's will itself. This recurring idea of a go-between, a connection to something higher that seems to be a really consistent element in human spirituality across the board.
Absolutely. And if we zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture, the very word angel, right? It comes from the Greek angelos, which means messenger.
Oh, why?
And if you look at dictionary definitions of angel, they point to both that religious sense of, a divine messenger and protector, but also a more figurative use describing someone who's incredibly kind or helpful, really highlights just how deeply this whole archetype of benevolence and assistance is woven into our language and how we make sense of the world.
Yeah. It really does. So let's start exploring some of those historical echoes of the divine, as our outline so eloquently puts it. When we turn to, those early religious texts, the initial portrayal of angels is very much focused on their role as messengers, delivering divine messages.
Right.
Think about the Annunciation to Mary, or when the angel appears to Joseph in the Gospels. Those are foundational stories for our listeners, and they really emphasize that role of communication. And then even outside of those direct biblical accounts, there's the story of Justin Martyr's conversion back in the 2nd century. It's so interesting how he was influenced by this mysterious old man, and some early interpretations saw that figure as well as another instance of divine guidance, maybe even an angelic one.
And what's especially striking in those early biblical examples, as you mentioned, is how much the emphasis is on the message itself. The angels often appear in this really human-like form. It seems like the main focus was on making sure that divine communication was coming through loud and clear. However, as we move through the biblical narratives, we start to see these specific angels, associated with particular functions.
That's right. We have Michael, often seen as this really powerful protector, and then Gabriel, the ultimate messenger.
Yeah.
And the book of Daniel gives us these pretty detailed accounts of how they appear to people. And it really underscores their power, and it even hints at this broader cosmic struggle, this conflict between good and evil spiritual forces.
It does, and this is where things get really interesting.
Right.
So if we connect this to how belief was developing in those early Christian communities, we see this emergence and growth of the idea of personal guardian angels. And people often refer to the story of Peter's miraculous release from prison in the book of Acts as support for this. And it's amazing how much that resonates even today with personal stories. Those moments when someone gets help from a stranger when they least expect it, or they just have this strong feeling of being protected and watched over. It seems to speak to this deep personal longing for divine care and companionship as we journey through life.
It really does. And it's interesting how the understanding of angels didn't stay the same throughout history. Our sources highlight how early on, in ancient Palestine, the perception was much more tangible. Angels were appearing in human form. They were even described as sharing meals with people.
Wow.
That's a big difference from later theological ideas that really emphasize their purely spiritual nature and use symbolism like wings to represent their ability to move between the earthly and heavenly realms. What do you think might have caused that shift in understanding?
That is a great question. I think it was probably a combination of factors. As theological reflection became deeper, especially with the influence of Greek philosophy, there was this growing focus on God's transcendence and the nature of spiritual beings. So that symbolic language probably became a way to express how different they were and their connection to the divine in a way that was more profound than just depicting them as powerful humans.
That makes a lot of sense. And if we go even further back beyond the Abrahamic traditions, we find what seem to be the ancient roots of heavenly messengers in cultures like the Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and Persians, and Zoroastrianism in particular stands out as a potential origin point.
Interesting.
The Sumerian Anunnaki, for example. Some scholars see them as a possible influence on those Judeo-Christian legends of fallen angels. And Zoroastrianism really developed this complex idea of an angelic hierarchy, which later had an influence on Jewish mystical thought. It just goes to show how interconnected many of these ancient spiritual ideas really were.
It's remarkable to trace those threads across thousands of years.
It is. But it's important to note that belief in angels wasn't always universal, was it? Our sources also point out that there's been skepticism about angels throughout history, even within religious traditions like certain Puritan views. What do you think drove that skepticism?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in some cases, that skepticism came from a concern about shifting worship or focus away from God. There was a desire to keep a direct relationship with God without putting too much emphasis on these intermediaries. It highlights how there's always been this tension within religious thought about the nature and role of these spiritual beings.
And speaking of the power of belief and narrative, we have that fascinating legend of the Angels of Mons from World War I. Now, despite there not being any verifiable evidence, the story of those angels intervening during that battle, it really captured the public imagination. There are all sorts of descriptions of these angels, from medieval archers to more traditional winged figures. It just shows how a captivating story can take hold, especially when people are going through intense stress and uncertainty.
It does. And it highlights how cultural context and how individuals interpret things play such a huge role in shaping these angel stories. That deep human desire for hope and for a sense that God is intervening, that can be incredibly powerful, especially when people are facing overwhelming adversity.
So moving on to those whispers in the modern world, it's clear that claims of people encountering angels, they haven't gone away. If anything, with the internet and all sorts of media being everywhere, they might be even more widespread and accessible than ever before. You know, we see personal stories being shared in books, online platforms, and podcasts.
Oh.
And as we mentioned earlier, a recurring theme is this idea of being protected from harm. We even have that really interesting example of a couple who truly believed that an angel intervened to stop their car from going off a bridge.
It's pretty remarkable how many of these modern day claims there are. Online platforms like that Catholic exorcism website that's mentioned in our sources, they're like digital libraries filled with tons of personal angel stories. And the examples are all over the place, preventing house fires, helping people find lost things, ensuring someone can receive last rites, or prompting someone to pray out of the blue.
Yeah.
These accounts really paint this picture of angels being actively involved in the daily lives of people who believe.
They do. And it's those deeply personal stories that often have the biggest impact, don't you think? Like that person who talked about interacting with angels their whole life, and not just the typical winged beings, but also angels appearing as humans.
Yeah.
They even described a guardian angel who looked like a thug, which is not what you'd expect at all. It really challenges our preconceived notions about what an angel might look like or how they might show up.
It definitely does, and it highlights how personal and subjective these experiences are. We see this also in how people today interpret deceased loved ones as having become guardian angels, or how they tend to see ordinary events as having some kind of angelic significance.
Yeah.
It's as if people are actively searching for and finding these connections in their own lives and experiences.
Right, and our sources talk about how platforms like Guideposts collect these examples of people interpreting natural phenomena. They see angel shapes in clouds or lampposts that looks like an angel, or they find feathers in unexpected places. It's like they see the natural world as being full of potential messages if you're just open to recognizing them.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And we can't forget about near-death experiences. Those encounters with spiritual beings that people have during these profound moments, they're often interpreted as interactions with angels. You know that example of the person who saw an angel holding a clipboard with all these divine promises written on it? That's a powerful image, and it speaks to this deep hope for the future.
It does. And while personal stories and interpretations are so central to this modern technology, plays a part too, doesn't it? In how these stories are shared and perceived.
Oh, absolutely.
People share photos and even security camera footage of things they believe are angel sightings. And while there are often natural or skeptical explanations offered for these events, the desire to document and share these experiences, that's definitely there.
It is, and we have those compelling personal accounts of people feeling like angels intervened in moments of real danger or crisis, like a near accident that was avoided or something that could have disrupted a church service being prevented. These stories really reinforce that core belief in angels as active protectors in our lives.
They do. And it's not just individual anecdotes either. Now we have entire platforms dedicated to sharing these accounts, like the podcast, Real Life Angel Encounters, and lots of channels on YouTube. And the themes that keep popping up are guidance in tough situations, rescue from harm, deep comfort when people are going through difficult times, and a feeling of connection to the afterlife and to loved ones who have passed away.
And within specific faith communities like the Catholic Church, dedicated websites such as Opus Angelarum and Catholic Online, those serve as really important platforms for sharing angel stories within that specific religious framework, often with a focus on receiving guidance in daily life and feeling protected through the intercession of angels.
So if we shift our focus now to guardians and messengers,
Yeah.
roles and significance, it's clear that angels serve as these essential intermediaries in so many religious traditions.
Yeah.
In Western religions in particular, they're generally understood as benevolent spiritual beings who effectively bridge that gap between the divine realm and the earthly plane, acting as messengers, servants of God, or protective guardians. And as we've been discussing, that concept of angelic hierarchies, that's pretty prevalent too.
Absolutely. And in Christianity, the emphasis on angels as God's messengers is especially strong. They're seen as actively ministering to those who will inherit salvation. Even Jesus himself talked about children having their own angels. And the development of those detailed hierarchical structures, like the influential work of Pseudo Dionysius, that really emphasizes how important these celestial beings have been historically within Christian thought. Ultimately, the belief in angels, it often leads to a deep sense of trust in divine providence and care.
And in the Jewish tradition, the belief in angels as guardians is also very important. The Hebrew word malach, it primarily means messenger. So that core function is there from the very beginning. And while the Hebrew scriptures only name a handful of specific angels, there are countless unnamed messengers carrying out God's will. Rabbinic literature expands a lot on their roles and attributes, even suggesting that each person is accompanied by both a good and a challenging angel throughout their life.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that even though angels are significant in Jewish tradition, the level of active belief and focus on them can vary within contemporary Jewish practices, which probably reflects different theological priorities and the impact of modern rationalism. However, their historical and theological importance within Judaism is undeniable.
And then we have the Islamic view, where angels are highly revered as heavenly beings created by Allah from light or fire. They're understood as being different from us in that they don't have physical desires or free will. Their existence is all about constant worship and complete obedience to God. And there's a very detailed understanding of named angels, each with specific and crucial duties, like Jibril, who's similar to Gabriel Michael, who's comparable to Michael Israfil, who's associated with the end times, and Azrael, the angel of death. Belief in angels is considered a fundamental pillar of Islamic faith.
And it's so fascinating to look beyond the Abrahamic faiths and see these angel-like figures appearing in other traditions too. You know, the divas in Hinduism and Buddhism, the Valkyries in Norse mythology, the fairies in Celtic mythology. While they each have their own unique features and stories, they often share those core roles of being helpers, protectors, or intermediaries in some way. It suggests this really profound and widespread human tendency to imagine these benevolent beings who act as go-betweens.
It does, and to make this even clearer, our sources include this helpful table that compares key attributes of angels in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam across several categories. Their creation, whether they have free will or not, their gender, the existence and nature of hierarchies, key named figures, and their primary roles. It really illuminates both the common ground and the distinctive aspects within each of these major religious traditions.
What's particularly insightful when you look at that comparison is how all three traditions fundamentally see angels as created beings who are ultimately serving the divine will. But those different perspectives on free will and the specific details of their hierarchical structures that really highlights the unique theological frameworks within each faith.
Now, as we get into the whole debate about belief and skepticism, it's obvious that there are very different ways of looking at these angel stories. From a perspective that's rooted in faith, these encounters are seen as genuine interactions with divine beings, and communication happens through different means like dreams, intuition, significant signs, and even direct personal interaction.
And for people who hold this belief, personal experiences are often incredibly powerful validation. That unexpected assistance, that feeling of comfort that you can't explain, those moments that seem to defy logic, those are often interpreted as real evidence of angelic presence and intervention in their lives.
But it's important to acknowledge the skeptical perspectives too, which offer alternative explanations for these experiences. These viewpoints might say that angel stories are just psychological interpretations of events or the result of suggestion or altered states of consciousness, especially during times of high stress or emotional intensity. The human mind, we know it's naturally inclined to look for patterns and meaning even when they might not actually be there objectively.
Exactly. And cognitive science of religion offers this naturalistic framework for understanding why these beliefs might persist across cultures and throughout history. Concepts like the hyperactive agency detection device suggest that our brains are wired to detect the presence of agents even in ambiguous situations. And then there's the idea of minimally counterintuitive concepts. Those ideas that are mostly familiar but have a few surprising or unusual elements. They tend to be more memorable and easier to spread, which could definitely explain why certain angelic attributes and narratives have endured for so long.
It's also interesting that neuroscience research has touched on this area, suggesting there might be neural correlates for religious experiences and that strong sense of presence that some people describe. While this research doesn't fully explain angel encounters, it does give us another way to understand these subjective experiences.
And our sources point out that scholarly articles approach this topic from all sorts of angles. Some argue that angels should be studied primarily within their specific theological context as divinely created beings with specific roles within a religious framework. Others offer more critical analyses, looking at the potential psychological or even ideological purposes that belief in guardian angels or other forms of angelic intervention might serve for individuals and communities.
In the end, it seems like the phenomenon of angel stories is this really complex interplay of personal faith, individual experiences, prevailing cultural narratives, and our own built-in cognitive wiring. Regardless of whether someone believes in a literal sense, these stories clearly tap into some very basic human needs, for hope, for meaning, and for a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves.
That's a crucial point, and it leads us right into thinking about angels on screen and page. Contemporary media has, without a doubt, played a significant role in shaping how we collectively imagine and understand angels in the modern world.
Oh, absolutely. In literature, angels pop up across a huge range of genres. Christian fiction often explores themes of spiritual warfare between angels and demons. Paranormal romance often portrays angels as romantic figures or protectors. Fantasy literature puts them into these elaborate worlds, often with their own complex hierarchies and histories. And of course, there's nonfiction that digs into angel beliefs from historical, theological, and even personal experience perspectives, as well as a rich tradition of angelology within Catholic literature.
And in movies, the way angels are portrayed has been incredibly diverse, ranging from those classic depictions of kind guiding figures to more modern and sometimes darker interpretations as evil antagonists or beings with questionable morals. Films like Ordinary Angels even explore the idea that everyday people can show angelic qualities through acts of selfless kindness and compassion.
And TV has definitely had its share of angels too, from long-running fantasy shows to more down-to-earth dramas that explore themes of faith and intervention. And with the rise of streaming platforms like Angel Studios, we're seeing more and more faith-based content that often includes angelic themes. Plus, as we've talked about, religious websites are still those online spaces where people share their personal stories and artistic representations of angels.
And it's not limited to just traditional media either. Even in modern art, we're seeing the angel figure come back, often with more complex and symbolic interpretations that go beyond those traditional serene depictions.
Oh.
Artists are exploring the more mysterious and maybe even unsettling aspects of these beings.
It's clear that even in our increasingly secular world, angels still hold a significant and evolving place in our cultural imagination. And all these different forms of media are key to keeping those stories alive, adapting them, and making sure they still resonate with audiences today.
Which brings us to thinking about those recurring threads of connection. When you look at angel stories throughout history and in our present day, certain fundamental themes and patterns just keep coming up.
They do. We consistently see angels as messengers. That's like their foundational role across so many traditions. Then there's this widespread idea of them as protectors and guardians, offering safety, guidance, and support. And that motif of unexpected help arriving in a moment of crisis, often from an unseen source, that's a powerful one. We also see this recurring interpretation of everyday things like clouds, feathers, or number sequences as potential angelic signs or messages. And of course, that deeply personal belief in each of us having our own guardian angel watching over us. And let's not forget that enduring narrative of the constant battle between good and evil in the spiritual realm.
What's so striking about all these recurring themes is how deeply they connect with those basic human needs and desires. The need for hope when things are tough, for a sense of protection and security in a world that often feels uncertain, and for a feeling of connection to something good and powerful that's bigger than ourselves. It really speaks to how enduring and important these stories are.
And as we wrap up with our comparative celestial tapestry, it's fascinating to consider both the ways angels are understood similarly and differently across various religious and cultural contexts. We see those parallels in their core roles as messengers and protectors, but we also see distinct differences in how they're described, from winged humans to more subtle or energetic forms, and in how our understanding of them has changed over time within different belief systems.
And like we talked about earlier, that table comparing angels in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam really highlights those key distinctions: the nature of their creation, their relationship with the divine, whether they have free will or not, the complexity of their hierarchical structures, the specific roles of certain named angels, and the overall way they interact with humanity.
In the end, it seems like while there are these universal recurring themes that speak to our shared human longings, there are also culturally specific interpretations and theological nuances that shape how we understand those beliefs about angels in more detail within different traditions.
Exactly. And as we conclude this deep dive into angel stories, it's really clear that they're this long-standing and incredibly diverse phenomenon that truly reflects this ongoing human fascination with the possibility of a spiritual world and how it interacts with ours.
Absolutely. Those recurring roles of messengers, protectors, and guides, they resonate so strongly with our core human desires for meaning in life, for comfort when we're struggling, and for a sense that maybe we're not totally alone in this vast universe.
And while there's so many different ways to look at these stories, from deep literal belief to more skeptical psychological interpretations, that very complexity is part of what makes them so endlessly interesting and worth thinking about.
So, no matter how you, our listener, personally interpret them, angel stories definitely speak to that deep and lasting human need for meaning, for comfort, and for a sense of connection to something profound and maybe even sacred. It's beyond our immediate material world.
This leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder. How does the fact that angels have been present in human stories for so long, across so many cultures and throughout history, how does that reflect our innate and maybe even universal longing for the transcendent and for the possibility that there are unseen forces at work in our lives? Whether you understand these stories through the lens of faith, psychological insights, or cultural tradition, what are the personal experiences or specific stories that resonate most deeply with your own understanding of these celestial beings? It's something to really sit with and think about.
It really is.
Until next time, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks, everyone.